Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about history of science and technology. I Today I was just doing the keynote talk for our annual Wolfram Technology Conference. I realize it's the 36th time that I have done this. It's kind of feels like quite an arc of history there. It was a bit of an intense effort. One might think that after 38 years, there'd be nothing more to say about Wolfram language and the technology we're producing at Wolfram Research and so on. But one would be wrong, because I just discovered that 2.5 hours wasn't even close to enough time to talk about the things we've been up to over the past year. In any case, I finished that, so now I get to do something more relaxing and be with you guys and talk about history of science and technology. So let's see. Ulla here asks, if you were transported back in time to, say, the time of Aristotle, what would you do? What would you pursue in terms of career or research? Gosh. Well, I think I'm very fortunate to live in the times that I do, because this great paradigm of computation that I've spent most of my life exploring has sort of just opened up in the time that I've been around to be able to work with it. I mean, computers got to the point where sort of individual people, at least researchers, could use them right around the time when I started to be able to seriously use them. I mean, I think I first saw a computer when I was 10 years old in about 1969, 1970. I first used a computer in 1972, 1973, big computer program with paper tape, size of a big desk and so on. And I first got the chance to use kind of a leading edge computer by 1976, and kind of have been tracking the leading edge of computers ever since. And sort of had the chance to really start using computers when they could first really be seriously used for science and intellectual kinds of work. And that's been a great ride. Now, some part of what I've done is computer experiments. And I started doing those back around 1980 or so. And it's actually, I did them even earlier than that. But I started doing them seriously and systematically around 1980. It's just a tremendous methodology that I think is far from being as widely appreciated as it could be, to be able to just sort of point this computational telescope, in effect, out into the computational universe and just see what's out there, see what all these simple programs typically do, and so on. And the thing that's been very striking to me is you run these little programs and they do all these incredibly complicated things. Many of those things look very organic. They look very lifelike. And so I kind of often talk about kind of exploring the computational animals and so on. And so one thing that I think I can say is, if I was transported back into the 19th century, definitely one of the things that I would be doing would be sort of being a naturalist, studying, classifying, exploring the implications of all the sort of creatures of the earth type thing. Maybe I would have had a chance to do some more sort of formal mathematical kinds of things too. I think, but that's the fairly recent past. If you go back to ancient Greek times, well, gosh, I mean, there are many more accidents of birth in those days than there are in today's world, at least in most places. So let's assume I was kind of in a stratum of society where I could like do intellectual kinds of things rather than purely manual labor or something like this, or purely being in the army or something. I think I probably would have tried to be a philosopher, or what they called a philosopher in those days. I mean, Aristotle, I think Aristotle's day job involved lots of teaching, including famously of Alexander the Great. But the and I suppose that's something which I might have resented in my early life and found fun later on in life, as has happened in current times. But no, I suppose I would probably have tried to be a philosopher, though the criteria for being a successful philosopher back in the 5th century BC or 4th century BC are not completely clear to me. And I think one of the important things is if you want to do much at all, you kind of have to live long enough to do it. And that was much more of a challenge in those days than it is today, I think. Although my guess is that there was much more of a kind of the sort of the world today has much more ability to stop people doing stupid things that would kill them quickly type thing than it probably did in those days. And it was sort of a question of looking out for yourself more at those times. Let's see. Ivy is asking, why are Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates the names most people think of when thinking about ancient society and science? I think that kind of Plato was kind of a key organizer of Plato's Academy, which lasted for a really long time, like 500 years altogether. It's kind of as a definer of kind of what was important in learning. And Socrates was significant in taking things about kind of everyday life and applying kind of philosophical kind of scrutiny to those things. And I think people found what they had to say quite compelling. I mean, some of what Plato had to say are things that seem kind of nutty today, particularly in terms of sort of political organization and so on. And then Aristotle, coming out of that same kind of school, Aristotle was very much of a list maker, very much of a kind of encyclopedist of everything. I mean, whether he was making lists of sea creatures or making lists of causes of things or making lists of the structure of arguments, some of those kinds of lists that he made turned out to be really important, like lists of kinds of arguments that turned into syllogistic logic and then the logic that we have today. Things that causes, well, certainly people learnt about those a lot. I mean, I think that Aristotle in particular was fortunate in being sort of picked up as the kind of the encyclopedist of wisdom, particularly by Thomas Aquinas and by the Catholic Church. And sort of Aristotle became kind of the source of wisdom that was somehow kind of complementary to the Bible. And that was an important driver of kind of the popularity of Aristotle, at least in through many, many centuries. I think it is interesting, I have to say, I probably should have read all of these people's works more carefully than I have. And probably much of their work did not survive. I mean, Socrates, we don't have anything that he wrote himself. It all comes from Plato. Aristotle, we have a fair amount of what he wrote, but we certainly don't have everything. I think Aristotle was a very prolific writer, and some of what he kind of wanted to explain everything, wanted to talk about everything and explain everything. And I don't think he really knew what was going to turn out to be sensible and what wasn't going to be sensible. He just said, I'm going to write down what I think about everything, what I think about how physics works, what I think about metaphysics. Metaphysics, the original term, was just the book that came after the physics book, because meta means after in Greek. But metaphysics became sort of this kind of question about kind of the why the world is the way it is, and kind of the underlying structure, the underlying kind of formal structure of things beyond the actuality of the physical world. And I think something that I think is kind of exciting today is that we get to remerge physics and metaphysics today. I mean, in our physics project, we both have an understanding that connects with existing physics and existing theories of physics and theory of gravity, theory of quantum mechanics, and so on. And we have something that kind of drills down to this idea of the Rulliad and the role of us as observers in the Rulliad. We kind of drill down to a level that feels much more metaphysical. And I think we have sort of the opportunity now to have sort of a relinking, as Aristotle once had them linked, between sort of the physics and the metaphysics, and to get sort of a lower level understanding both of the physical world and of sort of the conceptual structure of how things work. But, you know, what did and didn't survive from ancient times? As I say, Aristotle got a big boost through the Catholic Church. The works, I don't know the precise path through which the works of Plato survived. Certainly the works of Euclid, another ancient thinker of whom we have a fair amount of information. I mean, Euclid, we know, wrote other books than his Elements, and we don't have those. But Euclid's Elements of Geometry were something that was kind of very much became sort of the template for mathematics and how mathematics should be done. And Euclid's Elements were copied and reprinted and made in many editions. In fact, it certainly claimed that the two most printed books, the two most popular books in history, are the Bible and Euclid's Elements. And Euclid's Elements kind of, there are endless translations and interpretations. Euclid himself just wrote down like 460 propositions, statements, like the just statements about if you take two circles and do this, then they intersect in that kind of thing. He didn't write the proofs. The proofs were all added by subsequent interpreters. But we know that kind of Euclid remains sort of, it's good lesson in the fact that sort of pure science can have great longevity. The kind of the sort of the stories and beliefs and so on that don't necessarily have such longevity, but by the time you're dealing sort of just the pure geometry, so to speak, there's a certain sort of persistence to that through time. I mean, it always strikes me that when you see from ancient Egypt, for example, you see dice that are in shapes of, let's say, icosahedron or a dodecahedron. It's kind of remarkable that this thing that may come from 3,000 years ago sort of looks completely modern. It is a geometrical form that is quite timeless. And I feel that way about a lot of the things that I've had the good fortune to sort of discover in the computational universe. These things which we can render as images, these kind of arrangements of black and white squares or whatever else it is, they're completely timeless. They are the thing you get whenever you apply those abstract rules and so on. But in any case, I think, you know, Euclid also had a lot of carry through to modern times. Some other schools of philosophy, particularly a bunch of the pre-Socratic philosophers, like the Epicureans, for example, didn't have such a good time, and their works did not survive, probably because they didn't get sort of entrained in these sort of strands that were very successful in the world. And there's sort of this hope that we may learn more about the Epicureans because there was a library in Pompeii that was in Herculaneum, the other city that was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. But in any case, this library was in a fancy villa that was at one point owned by Julius Caesar's father-in-law, well, of the father of Julius Caesar's later wife. But that library the librarian there seems to have been Epicurean and an enthusiast of Epicurus. And the scrolls, maybe 10,000 of them for all we know, were all buried when Vesuvius erupted, and they were all kind of carbonized, but they've survived. And there's a project now to try and use modern machine learning techniques together with CT scanning to try and decode what's on all those scrolls. And there's still many more scrolls to be excavated, which perhaps fortunately have not been excavated in the past, because perhaps if they had been, people would have tried to unroll them, they would have just fragmented and we would lose all of what was on them. But now it's quite possible that we will learn much more about what the Epicureans had to say about science, about life, and so on, than we've ever known before. And perhaps the balance of what people know from ancient times will shift. It's perhaps a question of what happened to be preserved more than what thoughts were worth preserving, so to speak, to us, looked at from a modern point of view. I mean, I'm always something of an enthusiast of the Epicureans, partly because they had models of physics I think were more convincing than Aristotle, such as we know them. I mean, for example, Democritus, who was one of that crowd, none of his original writing has survived. Only what's survived is only what other people said about him. But Democritus was famous for having pushed the idea of atoms, the idea of that the universe is made from things that are all sort of identical tiny elements, and that's how the universe is constructed. And that's very resonant with things that I tend to think in modern times about hypergraphs and constructing everything in space and everything in it from those kinds of common elements. You know, actually in probably 150 AD, there was a chap called Lucretius who hopefully his writings are preserved in this volcano-covered library. But Lucretius wrote a book in Latin now called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, that is kind of in the Epicurean school, and it was kind of it was written in poetic form, but it was kind of describing how the world is put together. And one of my favorite things about that book is that Lucretius describes the world and its construction, and he says it's made of atoms, and you should have the analogy for atoms that they're like words in a language, in a human language, for example. And the laws of nature are like the grammar by which you put together those atoms, those words of human language. It's like there's a grammar of nature that puts together the atoms of nature as a grammar of language puts together the words of a language. And I thought that was a very lovely metaphor coming from 2 millennia ago. That's very aligned with a lot of the things we've thought about in recent times. And it's always nice to see that kind of there are ideas for which there were precursors a very, very long time ago. And sometimes, to me at least, it feels like a greater responsibility in terms of delivering those ideas today. If those were ideas that somebody basically had them 2,000 years ago, but they didn't have the tools to actually deliver them at that time, and we now do have those tools, it feels sort of more of a responsibility for us to actually take those ideas and do something with them after all this time than it perhaps would have done if we hadn't known that there was a precursor to these ideas from a very long time ago. Let's see. Well, lots of questions here. There's questions about antiquity. Let me, Des comments, almost all of these philosophers were also physicists. Well, natural philosophy was what physics was born from. And it was still natural philosophy when Isaac Newton was writing his Principia in 1687. That's why he called it, Principia Mathematica. Let's see if I can do the Latin cases correctly. No, I'll tell you the English. Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. It was really only really after Newton and after kind of the injection of a lot of mathematics into natural science that natural philosophy broke off this field of physics. It is always interesting to see the genealogy of fields. What breaks off from what? For example, in modern times, like biology, for example, molecular biology became really a separate field from biology. It's biology that was studying organisms and their and their sort of systematic biology and so on, organismal biology, really became a separate field from molecular biology. It's a sort of a split off. Another thing a bit like that was mathematics that ejected computer science back in the 1940s to 1950s, again, became a separate field. It is interesting to see these separate fields emerge. I mean, I think this field that I call ruleology, the study of systems based on rules, that's something else which is not part of computer science, not mathematics. It's its own thing. And that's why I called the big book that I wrote about these things a new kind of science. That's sort of slowly splitting itself off, but there's more organizational structure that's needed to do that. But yes, in the past, sort of everybody was both a philosopher and a physicist, and there wasn't really such a distinction made between natural law and things like human law. There was it was thought that you could think through everything about nature, just as you could think through things about human affairs. Now, again, interestingly enough, with the things we're doing in very recent times with the Ruliad and things like this, we're back to a situation where you might be able to think through nature. See, the thing is that for a lot of history, people just thought the laws of nature are just given to us. They're presented. They are not something that we could ever derive. They're something that just is the way that they are as a matter of the happenstance of our universe, so to speak. And you could attribute them to, delivered by God, injected through some sort of some simulation that's being done by sort of the uber creatures, so to speak. But in any case, not something that can come from within us, not something that we can expect to derive. And in the history of science, the idea that natural laws are derivable is complicated. And one characteristic example was the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy increase, which had this feeling in the 1800s, the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s, it might just be derivable. It might be something where if you have all those molecules bouncing around, it becomes a matter of mathematics that the entropy has to increase or the randomness has to increase and so on. That's what Ludwig Boltzmann thought, and that a sequence of people tried to kind of prove the second law of thermodynamics. Boltzmann more from this sort of purely mathematical point of view, other people like Planck and Clausius and so on from sort of exogenous physical effects. Like Planck, for example, famously was trying to prove the second law of thermodynamics and to prove that entropy would increase as a result of radiation, black body radiation and so on. And it was through that effort that he came to actually study black body radiation more carefully, and then realized that if you wanted to fit the spectrum of black body radiation, you had to go back to something that Boltzmann had talked about, which is the possibility of, Boltzmann as a mathematical matter had said, what if energy comes in discrete quanta? He didn't call them quanta, in discrete lumps, so to speak. Then he could work out the mathematics more easily. But for Boltzmann, he said, but of course, energy is not in these discrete lumps. But Planck noticed in 1900 that actually the black body spectrum that had been observed that he'd wanted to look at, because he wanted to prove the second law of thermodynamics, that black body spectrum actually fit the distribution that Boltzmann had created for purposes of for purposes of just understanding what would happen just doing the mathematics with discrete elements. So, and it took Planck another 10 years before he really believed in quanta. I think Albert Einstein was really sort of the first person who really sort of believed in quanta in a serious way. Of course, Einstein himself, before his 1905 year, which was sort of his miracle year where he figured out Brownian motion, figured out the photoelectric effect, the existence of photons, and figured out special relativity. Before that year, the year before, 1904, he wrote a paper about the second law of thermodynamics. And he tried to give a proof of the second law of thermodynamics from sort of pure thought, an almost philosophical proof of the second law of thermodynamics, which was not correct. But in any case, the idea that things might be kind of just derivable from philosophical first principles reappeared in physics with the work on the second law of thermodynamics, particularly by Boltzmann. And Einstein was a big Boltzmann enthusiast, kind of took that idea and applied it to the derivation of special relativity in particular, and to a lesser extent, photoelectric effect and photons and Brownian motion. So kind of that idea that things might be derivable, that special relativity might be, in a sense, philosophically derivable, was one that emerged there. Now, in the derivation of special relativity, Einstein was leveraging Maxwell's equations for the electromagnetic field and things about the kind of the propagation of light and so on. And those are not things that I think Einstein believed were in any way derivable. He thought those were just things that happen to be that way because the natural world happens to be that way. The thing that is really surprising now is through our thinking about the Rouliad and so on, it's becoming clear that, in fact, things like relativity, general relativity, quantum mechanics, as well as the second law, by the way, are in fact derivable from something that is kind of foundational, that is necessary, that is inevitable, that is merely an abstract formality, so to speak, derivable with the assumption that the entities that are observing things are observers like us, observers that have characteristics that are at least loosely like us. And that seems to be sufficient to be able to derive these laws of physics. It's something that would have been very appealing to the philosophers of ancient times, but they didn't have anything even close to the kind of intellectual stack and technology stack that we've needed to really make progress with that. But it's sort of an exciting thing that we're back, as I say, to the merging of physics and metaphysics, and to the possibility of deriving the laws of nature from knowing our nature, so to speak. We can derive those laws of nature. So let's see. It's comment from Jen. How did ancient thinkers like Democritus come up with ideas about atoms and matter? I don't think we know. I think they were trying to reason about the way the world is, and they noticed that oftentimes the same stuff happens in many places in the world. Water is the same here and there. A crystal might have the same form here and there. And so they were wondering, I think, kind of how could that be? What's the explanation for the sort of the repetitiveness of things? And I suspect that that's what led them to the idea that maybe everything is just made of the same thing, but in different configurations. That's my guess, at least. I think we don't know. This question of whether people explain why they think what they think is an interesting one. And many times in history, what the written record very much doesn't explain why people think what they think. For example, I mentioned Euclid, where he wrote down his statements of his proposition, but not the proofs. So we have no idea how he came to believe these things. We only know that he said, this is a thing worth writing down. In modern academic papers, for example, the same tendency happens. People will say, for example, in math papers, it's really common for people to just jump right in, say, let F be a field with these properties, and then this and this and this follow. It's like, well, why were you studying that? Well, we don't explain that. This is an academic paper. We don't talk about our thought processes. We don't talk about those seemingly more human aspects of what was going on. When I write things, I try to explain a bunch more about that because I think it's very useful for contextualizing one's understanding of things. And it's also it's great when there is a written record of why people thought things. In my efforts of doing kind of scientific history and scientific biography, that's always the big question. Why did they think that? Why did they come to that idea? I was just interested in, I've been studying the history of neural nets and their sort of prehistory back into the 1800s and so on. And I was very curious, a wonderful quote from Ada Lovelace from 1843, I think, where she says, talking about her work, she's done this work on Babbage's analytical engine, and she's thinking about new work that she might do. And she says in some letter, I wish to bequeath to the generations a calculus of the nervous system. And she says also there that I don't think that there should be any reason why cerebral matter should be any less amenable to methods of science than sidereal matter, that is, things about planets and so on. Um, and so I was wondering, why did she think that? What was going on at the time where even the concept of cerebral matter came up and a calculus of the nervous system? Where did those kinds of ideas come from? I don't know the full answer yet, but I do know some pieces of it. It is curious that that was the time right around then when the telegraph was new technology. That was the high tech of its time. Samuel Morse, the 1830s and so on. And then in England, Charles Whetstone, who had sort of was setting up the telegraph in England. And curiously, it turns out that the people were describing the telegraph as the nervous system of the country. So that's kind of a clue about sort of a thinking, a connection between electrical telegraph kinds of things and nervous systems. So that was something people were already thinking about in the 1840s. I have to say I am working on this project, and I'm going to give a shout out to the Internet Archive and their books project, because when you're studying particularly the history of the 1800s, it's sort of a peak of use of all those millions of scanned books that are out of copyright and so on. And it's just an amazing source for doing historical research. Unfortunately, the Internet Archive got attacked with a DDoS attack, and it's been down for the past week or so. And so my efforts to study this history have been thwarted, and for this time. But it makes me all the more aware of how important it is to be able to immediately find sort of scanned versions of all of this printed material from that time. And what's significant there is that some of that printed material is famous books, but a lot of it is not famous books. It's just books that existed, and at any given time, there's kind of the stuff that gets preserved and everybody's excited about and continues to be excited about, and the stuff that gets written but not really paid attention to for better or worse reason at the time. But if you're trying to trace this intellectual history, it's important to have all the stuff, and that's a critical thing there. But I think this question about sort of how did people come to think the things they think is sort of an essence of scientific history, to figure that out. And the thing that I've found repeatedly is that you can figure it out. It's like, how did Ada Lovelace end up thinking about a calculus of the nervous system? I haven't figured that out yet, but I will. I'm confident that I will figure it out. I'll know that came through maybe Boole, who was talking about laws of thought in connection with logic, maybe Augustus de Morgan, who was talking about kind of thinking about logic and so on. Maybe other people, maybe through this electrical kind of circuits thing, maybe through Faraday and his thinking about electricity and its significance. I'm not sure, but I know I'm going to figure it out. And it's but it's kind of a forensic operation to go after the fact and try and figure out, why do these people think these things. In some cases, it's always better when the things are written down. Sometimes in the past, one has letters that people wrote to each other, which contain some of this information. But often, as I say, in academia, in modern academia, that information is typically crushed out of the presentations that people make of things. In the early days of learned societies and journals and so on, in the 1600s, when people like Edmund Halley was the president of the Royal Society and so on, and was editing the proceedings of the Royal Society, in those days, the dispatches that people wrote, that were the papers read to the society, actually read in a place in London to the society and then printed in their proceedings, so to speak, those things were much more like blog post material of today. I mean, they would talk about how, I saw this animal and it had very weird behavior and it did this, but just as I came up to it, it ran away. And they say that. Or they say, I remember reading about the green flash, which is a phenomenon seen in over mountains at dawn. It's an optical atmospheric phenomenon, and there's a lot of sort of color, not just green, in the way this thing is described. About I was staying at this mountain chalet, and this happened, and that happened, and so on. Now, you might say, oh, that's really whimsical and irrelevant, but it's not, because, sometimes people would say, well, oftentimes when experiments have been done and people just sort of say, well, I did this experiment, I did this, this, and this, they don't say the context of it. And that's the reason people can't reproduce the experiment, because, by the way, they didn't mention, oh, I was in Denver when I did this at a different atmospheric pressure or something, or, oh, this or that other thing was happening. So I'm a great believer in the value of sort of expressing the context of science as well as the facts of the science itself, kind of the human wrapping around the science. I think it really not only helps to, it really helps to kind of explain, it helps to explain the ideas, but we typically don't have that from the past. Isler is asking, do you think letters or published books and essays are more useful for studying history? I think the number one thing about studying history is read the primary documents. Do not read, you can get an orientation by reading the kind of historical documents and the and what historians and others have written. And if what you want is to build on that history and to learn the lessons of that history and build from that, then that's what you need to read. But if you want to actually understand the history for itself, you have to go to the primary sources, because the layers of interpretation that have been applied, not only, well, the interpretation changes over time. There are things that we simply don't understand that we didn't understand in the past. We now do understand them. We can now sort of back project and see, well, these people almost understood what a computer was in 1690. But if we were looking at that in 1800, the concept of a computer just wasn't a concept. So there was no way we could sort of anchor, they almost understood this thing because we didn't know what the thing was. And that's a sort of repeated issue. And it's one of the reasons it's pretty hard. I mean, I think I get to this weekend go through a bunch of primary documents, haven't been looked through before, from like 100 years ago or so now, about history of neural nets, actually. And I don't know what I'll find, but it's a thing where it really helps that I kind of think I know quite a bit about neural nets today. And so you can sort of back project that information to the things that you're seeing from the past. And I think that's, but in terms of what to look at, I mean, I tend to try to read the sort of the finished published works. They're often kind of painful to read, and they often take a lot of effort to read, because they're very formalized in many cases. They're also, I don't know, they take effort. I find letters and things a bit more pithy often to read, and they do give one more of a sense of, they give one more of a personal sense of people. I mean, I think when one's trying to understand kind of somebody's intellectual works, having some understanding of the person is really quite important, and having certainly an understanding of their personal context. Like, look, they did this thing because what they actually did for a living was, they were a lens grinder, case of Spinoza, for example, and it was a high-tech thing of the time. Or, people will get so confused about different times, different contexts, and they'll tell sort of mythical stories about people. A very common one is, Albert Einstein was a lowly patent clerk when he discovered relativity. Well, he was a patent clerk, that's true. But what you've got to realize is that the patent office, the Bern patent office and so on, was like the Silicon Valley of its time. And the great technology of the time was refrigerators, which Einstein contributed to. He actually got some patents on refrigerators, perhaps not even unrelated to his work on the second law of thermodynamics, I'm not sure. But in any case, what happened was Einstein went from getting a respectable PhD in physics to doing what in modern times would be going to the tech industry, maybe going to finance, but closer to going to the tech industry. And indeed, in the tech industry, he was able to be perhaps more creative than the regular stodgy academics at the universities near him, and was able to come up with pretty good ideas like relativity and like photons and so on. So sort of the myth that he was in some kind of sort of terrible circumstances and so on is not really right. And when you understand that he was kind of sort of in a the analog of the Silicon Valley of its time, so to speak, that sort of helps contextualize the type of thinking and the type of sort of ambitious thinking that was going on there. And I think the thing, well, I find letters and so on are certainly useful for getting more of a personal sense of people, and getting just it all helps to kind of conceptualize things. Now, sometimes you read these things and you think, this is really a person I would have enjoyed meeting, or oh my gosh, this person would have been so kind of frustrating to meet because they were so kind of formalized and so on, or whatever else. But that isn't really the point. I mean, to know that, Leibniz, for example, was, you always see these pictures of Leibniz with this giant wig. Well, even in his time, people thought that wig was absurd. I mean, in the end, what you learn is he wore that wig because he was bald and he had this birth spot on his head that he thought looked really ugly. And so he wore this giant wig, not even a fashionable wig. He spent a lot of his time at court, and he was apparently always a favorite of the ladies at court, but they always made fun of his wig. So but Leibniz was also interesting for the fact that he was often trying to sell his services. I mean, if history had played differently, one of the things he did was he was a kind of a court intellectual, so to speak. And so he was asked to do sort of court intellectual activities. So, for example, the Duke of Hanover, I guess, was pushing him to write a history of that line, that sort of royal line. I think they had a particular objective in writing that history that had to do with proving that some marriage was really valid or possible or whatever else. But anyway, Leibniz for many years was kind of under the gun to write the history of the Hanoverian duchy or whatever it was. And he didn't get it done. And in fact, had he had it done, he would have ended up going in the court of George III, I guess, in England. And at the time, kind of Newton was in England and sort of a competitor of Leibniz. And Newton was doing all kinds of scurrilous things, appointing commissions at the Royal Society to study, Newton versus Leibniz's priority in certain things. And then Newton was sort of behind the scenes, the person who was the committee, more or less. So lots of scurrilousness, as has always happened. But in any case, at the time, kind of Newton was controller of the mint in England, and Leibniz, had he finished his history of the Dukes of Hanover or whatever, he probably would have been brought by George III to the court in England, and he would have had a much more elevated position than Newton in England. And the history of sort of Leibniz versus Newton would probably have played very differently. But in any case, that wasn't to be, because he didn't get his homework done. He didn't write the history of the Dukes of Hanover, although he interacted with them a lot. And for example, he spent a bunch of effort trying to do things like convince them that they should create a great library that would be a accumulation of all knowledge that you could essentially, well, as we would say in today's terms, compute from it. He was very big. His PhD thesis actually had been about the sort of settling of legal cases by using logic. And he kind of imagined that you could have this systematic source of truth that you could then derive things from. But in any case, a lot of these personal details are interesting in terms of understanding kind of the type of thinking that somebody will have followed, and trying to figure out things like, would he have taken the idea of computing in a certain direction? Did he have that kind of idea? Or did he have the idea that mathematics works differently? And those are things that you learn about by sort of getting to know the person. Des is asking about newspapers, pamphlets, journals, the lost or undervalued for not being books. Yeah, fortunately, a bunch of newspapers and things have been digitized, and I've certainly found very interesting things from that. I mean, even very recently, I was writing something about history from the 1980s and discovered that a bizarre little incident in mathematics had made it into the New York Times, which I wasn't aware of, and that was from scanned newspaper. But even in the past, a lot of strange connections that I wouldn't have made, I made because I was able to do searches and was able to find that, oh yes, the person who, invited Babbage to Italy turned out to be this person who was part of the Italian Corps of Engineers and later became Prime Minister of Italy and so on. And I found that sort of by those kinds of means, by these more informal documents. One class of informal documents that's quite challenged is computer manuals. And I myself have collected a fair amount of documentation from the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. But a lot of that is kind of not book-like. I mean, for example, in the case of Mathematica, I published the original documentation for Mathematica as a book. It was a very wide circulation book, as it turned out. And so that's something that's sort of firmly preserved. But for example, for my previous system, SMP, it wasn't, it's a book-sized object, but it wasn't published as a book. And so it's sort of, well, it's now on the web and things, but it's in much less obviously accessible. And I think that's a phenomenon. Now, the good news about printed documents is so long as you have one of them, you can scan it and it's in a format where you can read it. Something like a program from the 1970s, let's say, that's much more challenging. Like I have paper tape that I produced in 1973. I can't read that now. I've made some efforts. I'm sure in time it might be possible to do it. You can lay out strips of tape and just take pictures of it and then use image processing to read it. I mean, recently I was trying to read a floppy disk from 1982, a big floppy disk. Most floppy disks were 3.5-inch floppies. This was an 8.5-inch floppy. And despite the best efforts, my efforts, folks at the Computer History Museum and so on, we couldn't read this floppy, possibly because its magnetic domains had decayed in those intervening years, possibly because the data format, I think we could have probably decoded. I think that was the case of the magnetic medium having just degraded. But that's an issue. I mean, things which are printed, there's some fighting chance if you can find a copy of it that you can reconstruct it. I mean, that's why, for example, the Babylonians were so lucky that they put all their things on these clay tablets, which so long as the clay tablets survived, you've got something. But people where things were written on paper and so on, that probably decayed over the years, unless you were lucky enough to be buried in a volcano, so to speak. Well, not you perhaps, but your library. And perhaps 2,000 years later, people be able to use CT scanning and machine learning to decode what's going on. But I think, I'm trying to remember what other things. Yeah, I mean, I've some stuff from newspapers that I found. Well, actually, for example, in the history of neural nets, I've been trying to understand the history of a chap called Walter Pitts, who was one of the authors of the McCulloch-Pitts neural net paper from 1943. And there's a lot of stuff you can find, like you can find things like his draft registration card, the stuff from the Census Bureau, mentions in newspapers. Yeah, there was one actually that I found. This was an interesting one from a newspaper. I was writing an obituary of my friend Ed Fredkin, and I found this newspaper clipping from when he was a kid that was really, really amusing, interesting, and somewhat revealing. But that was a question of scanned newspapers and picking things up from that. So yes, that happens. I think another one. Well, there's a lot of kind of contextualization of history that you can find from sort of the newspaper headlines of the time. Like, for example, I was writing about the history of eclipses, and there's some, kind of the New York Times has very charming, I think their headline was something like "Lights Askew in the Heavens," maybe that was in the um, discovery of, well, Eddington's efforts to validate general relativity in 1919, or maybe that was the eclipse of 1925 or so. But in any case, the is very kind of not very science-sounding headline, but in any case, it's very useful for sort of contextualizing how people were thinking about things like eclipses at that time. Let's see. Uh, well, um, let's see. Sorry, I'm just looking through a lot of interesting questions here. I need to go back to my day job a little bit soon. Mean is asking about, would you run off and not drink the poison if you were Socrates? I think Socrates was a much more courageous human than many of the rest of us. I mean, he had been quite a distinguished warrior in his youth. And I don't think you get to be a warrior if you're kind of don't have a certain degree of physical courage and so on. I think the whole um, uh, drink the hemlock type thing, I think it was, uh, there were many points being made there, and so it's very a complicated story. I have to say I was quite amused talking of hemlock that I was when we were printing New Kind of Science book, turns out we wanted to use the special kind of paper, which is a particular very fine-grained paper that could carry these images very well. And turns out it's made from hemlock trees. And so the paper rep said, "Oh, don't worry. By the time it turns into paper in you don't have to worry about being like Socrates. By the time it's turned into paper in a book, it's been processed and added with this, and it isn't poisonous anymore. So it's kind of like it's okay, even if you eat the New Kind of Science book, don't digest it in other ways, but eat it, it won't be poisonous." Okay, so I kind of remembered this claim, and then a couple of years ago, I was at the 20th anniversary of New Kind of Science. I was writing about the making of the book, and so I decided to kind of dive in and try and understand the story of the hemlock forest in upstate New York, from which the paper that we were using was made. And it turns out hemlock trees are not related to hemlock the plant. It was a little sort of plant naming glitch of early settlers in New England who saw these trees, and apparently when their wood was burnt, it kind of reminded them a bit of the smell of the hemlock plant and so on. But the hemlock tree has nothing to do with the hemlock shrub. And this paper rep was, it's a I have no idea where they got their script from about the hemlock is not poisonous, it's been processed. Because the truth of it is, it's not poisonous because it has absolutely nothing to do with the plant that is poisonous. But just a funny thing about hemlock. Mean asks, do you think it's still possible to be a polymath today like Da Vinci was? Well, some of us try. I think I've been fortunate in that a lot of projects that I've done are, in a sense, meta projects, things like make a computational language to express computationally everything in the world, so to speak. That sort of forces you into understanding all these different areas. The thing that makes being polymathic or something possible, I think, in today's world is the commonality of thinking across all these different areas. And I think that in the end, a lot of it is tied together by these computational ideas, that those ideas are very universal across a lot of different areas. And once you're thinking in those terms, you kind of get to think across all these different areas. Now, having said that, every area has its own specific way of thinking, whether you're doing biology or law or economics or the entertainment industry or something different, they all have their own particular way of thinking. And even knowing that is pretty useful because you realize that, oh, I've got this way of thinking that comes from knowing physics, let's say. And then you say, well, I'm going to do biology. Well, it's just different. And you have to recognize that it's going to take you a while to sort of ingest that way of thinking. And sometimes the seams between those ways of thinking are pretty complicated. And I think the fact that there's sort of an overall infrastructure of like computational thinking that lets you kind of bridge those gaps between sort of the typical thinking of physics and the typical thinking of biology, let's say, is really important and really, really helpful in kind of the modern effort at polymathy, so to speak. I mean, it's also worth saying that once fields have developed, they're making only incremental progress typically. And the greatest growth comes at these seams between fields, the places where a new field is being created and so on. And to have a chance to contribute to those things, you really have to know all the sort of neighboring fields. It's something which, the LLMs do okay at, in the sense that they have sort of the big picture, roughly, in terms of at least how the words fit together across a lot of different fields. And so it's certainly plausible that they could make kind of, analogies of words like correspondences between different fields. Just like, Aristotle was able to make analogies between words, kinds of ways of saying that's a syllogism that follows logic in this way. And that's, even though the words are completely different and it's about a different subject, that's a syllogism that follows logic in the same way somewhere else. And I think that's sort of, the LLMs are natural polymaths, although there are many things they can't do. But I think that's it's something where it's, I don't know whether old Leonardo knew everything that was known at the time. I doubt it. I think if was he a skilled lawyer? Probably not. Was he a skilled accountant? He had this friend, Luca Pacioli, kind of the father of modern double entry bookkeeping. But I don't think Leonardo was the accountant, so to speak. In fact, we know Leonardo was okay at math, but didn't do some of the abstract math that already existed in his time. So I think, I think perhaps the thing that was most striking there was Leonardo got to think that he could think about everything, or everything that he cared about, from medicine to physics to technology and so on. And that's something which is perhaps more a matter of kind of one's own self-image and self-confidence than it is necessarily a pure matter of what one knows. And I think in modern times, something that I've tried to learn over the course of my life is that, yes, it actually, given the things one knows, given the things one can do, yes, it might actually be possible to contribute to this thing or that thing or the other thing. And it's been exciting to me to realize, well, actually, I think I can contribute to things about biology or things about, I don't know, computational law or things about these different areas. And I might have thought, well, I'm just started life as a physicist, and that's kind of that's the edge of my world, so to speak, is the edge of physics. And I suppose it's been a discovery, a personal discovery of mine, that a lot of the kind of methodology that I've learned, as well as a bunch of the actual facts, allows one to really say things in other areas. Now, one of the challenges is always, and I've seen this many, many times, people that I've known, you're very successful in one area, let's say in physics. And then the question is, can you actually say useful things about other areas? And sometimes the answer is yes. And sometimes the answer is a horrible no. And you really fall on your face. And the question is, what's the difference between kind of the cases where you actually do get to say really interesting things about, I don't know, molecular biology or mathematical finance or whatever else, and what are the cases where you kind of fall on your face and you end up just saying silly things? I think the major distinction is sort of something about the humility of entering different fields. You have to realize there's things to learn about the way of thinking in that field that, although you can transport some of the methods from the field you came from, you kind of have to learn something about the way of thinking, or the things you'll say are going to be, well, at best irrelevant in that field. Now, that's another point worth making, that it might be that you come from one field, like, for example, from physics or mathematics into biology, and you might say, I'm going to introduce theory in biology. But it might turn out that in the field of biology, nobody cares about theory. People just say, there isn't a theory. You just do experiments and see what happens. There can't be a theory, they implicitly think. And you come in from physics or mathematics and you say, look, there's a piece of theory here. But then the things about which you can make that theory are things where biologists will say, oh, well, that's amusing, but we don't care about that. What we care about is this other thing here that we find out with experiments. So sometimes it's like you go into some field and you're basically saying things that just don't fit with the way of thinking of that field, and they don't make sense in that field. Other times, they might be defining a new way of thinking in that field, which may not be very attractive to the people already in the field, but which may be important in defining the future of that field. And I think we've seen that with sort of computational X for lots of values of X, of sort of that becoming a redefinition of a field. And sometimes it comfortably fits with existing people, sometimes it doesn't. But that's been sort of an important direction there. All right, I think I need to wrap up soon. Gosh. Des says, I found a place that still produces postcards you play on a record player. Do you think that would be a good way of storing things like a password or crypto key or whatever, especially using steganography? Yeah, I've sometimes wondered what's the best way to store um, things. And I have to say, sometimes I've thought, just print it out on paper and stick it in a safe or something. That's a good way of making sure that you don't lose that password or whatever else. I think that I have a friend who's been have this project to put kind of little quartz discs and things on other places in the solar system, particularly on the moon. Some successes, some big splats, but that's a different story. And that's a thing you can do, although I don't really know how good that's going to be, because it's kind of like, one thing is it's for the future humans, another thing it's for the aliens. Forget the aliens, that's not going to work. The classic example of that not working was the Pioneer spacecraft that had or was it? No, Voyager had that golden disc, golden record, like a vinyl record, with grooves in it, and where you could play it, and it had all these sort of songs from Earth and so on. You could play it by using a little needle that goes up and down. It even had a diagram, on this plaque on the spacecraft of how to read it with a needle. But of course, at the time that spacecraft was sent in the 1970s, it was like, well, of course people will know how to play a record. It's the most obvious thing in the world. Well, to people today, it's not at all obvious. It's what is this weird thing with grooves and a helical groove and so on in it? It's how would you play that? And in fact, it's sort of amusingly, the only way I can imagine really playing it in modern times without a lot of trouble is to take high resolution images and just look at the grooves and just decode, oh, it's a big nuisance that it's a spiral, but let me decode that and get an image of it. So, this whole challenge of putting things in a form that survives is an interesting one. I mean, putting it in stone is a pretty good way to have it survive. I mean, there's lots of stuff we have that comes from ancient times, from ancient Egypt, Roman and Greek civilizations and so on, where they're in inscriptions, which are in stone. The Babylonians, again, with their fired clay, had a pretty good thing going, so long as those things are preserved. Now, it helps if you're, I don't know, Darius or something, who carved this inscription to the side of a mountain, and it's still there today. And I think that's where this kind of it's mostly a big thing about how great Darius is and how Darius has crushed all his enemies. And Darius is the greatest great of them all type thing. But that's something where you carve it in the side of a mountain, And, 2,500 years later, it's still there. Whether anybody cares about it is another story. And, for a lot of classical antiquity and Egypt, for example, people for a long time didn't care. I mean, people started caring again in the 1700s. Before that time, it was just like, oh, yeah, they're those ancient monuments. Who cares? And even in some cases, there's like, oh, yeah, they got some stone quarried out. Let's go use this thing like a quarry and just take pieces from this ancient monument to use for our buildings. So, it really varies with the course of human history, whether people are in a mode where they're looking back to history. I mean, Napoleon, for example, famously was very much into kind of the dignity of Egyptian civilization and kind of using that, I suppose, as often happens, to sort of buttress his own credibility with kind of linking to a past civilization. And I suppose that happens at times when there's sort of prosperity and lack of self-confidence in a civilization. It's like, well, let's look back to these earlier civilizations that we can now, we now feel good about the fact that we can sort of get their artifacts and so on because we're prosperous and generally can do those kinds of things. But yet we are kind of resting on sort of the credibility of that ancient civilization for what we're doing today. And I think that's so, it's really a question of what does one choose to preserve? I mean, for example, I was looking partly in connection with this putting quartz pieces of glass quartz type things on the moon and so on. I was curious about sort of time capsules on the Earth. And time capsules have a terrible history. I mean, people, when they build buildings and so on, they'll put this, box, they'll put it in the foundations of the building and so on. That was happening in Babylonian times as well. People would put inscriptions in the foundations of buildings they built, and the inscriptions would be basically written out to whoever saw that inscription must have been somebody who destroyed that building. And it would say things like, if you are seeing this stone, then, such and such a god who's my protector will have vengeance on you. So it was kind of like, you're not supposed to be seeing this. If you're seeing this, it means you just tore down our building. But in more modern times, it's like people will put those in skyscrapers. People will put them like, we're going to put this aside and open it 100 years later, and so on. And they have a horrible history. People usually forget that they're there and only coincidentally find them again. Then there's a story, I tell a funny story about John von Neumann, who was reputed to have put away a box that was supposed to be opened only 50 years after his death. And so I knew about this, and I happened to run into his granddaughter, and it was just about the time when this box was going to be opened. And she told me a couple of years later, yup, we opened the box. We had all the, the great grandchildren all around, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a big bust, because it turns out it wasn't even John von Neumann's box. So who knows where that story even came from. But the history of sort of preserving things over time and knowing what to do with this time capsule or box or whatever, that history is not very good. I mean, that history only tends to be good when there is kind of an ambient story, whether it's some, society or religion or something that sort of maintains its coherence over long periods of time, then maybe the right thing will happen with those things. I mean, it's kind of like one assumes that the Vatican Library, for example, has lots of very useful things in it, and one assumes that I don't know to what extent it's like. I remember Windsor Castle, for example, which is built in like 1000 AD, has sort of a storeroom, and somebody we were working with had occasion to go into the storeroom, and it's like it's full of 1,000 years of junk, and there's probably amazing stuff there, along with a bunch of kind of 1,000 years of accumulated junk. I always certainly remember when I was a kid, I happened to know a bunch of young British, folks who came from long aristocratic lines, and they would have these houses that were 400 years old or something, and they would have sort of attics with junk that had been built up over 400 years. And it's kind of then it has a certain there's a certain kind of what do you find in 400 years of junk? Well, some of it isn't junk. Some of it you don't even know whether it was junk, because it's like it might seem to you today like junk, but it might have seemed in the past like something really important, or it might seem in the past like something irrelevant. Oh, those random ramblings from that strange, cousin or something who turns out to have had been a very brilliant scientist or whatever else, but nobody knew it at the time. So it's really hard to have these things sort of survive, I suppose, the human aspect, in addition to just surviving in purely physical form. It's yeah, Haraz comments about falling back the storage of things and how long things last. I have a bunch of storage media. So that floppy disk I mentioned, that was a fail. I have some 9-track tape. We have managed to read most of the 9-track tape that I have from the 1980s. As I say, I haven't read the paper tape, although the paper tape exists and it is in principle readable. The story of the Library of Alexandria, I think has there are many sort of mythical stories about the Library of Alexandria, which I think had multiple locations in the end. But there are stories like when Cleopatra and Caesar were, they were going to have a battle, one where famously, and I mean, all these stories are probably embellished like crazy, but it's said that Cleopatra insisted. I mean, she was what, Cleopatra the Sixth or Cleopatra the Seventh or something in the Ptolemaic dynasty, but the famous Cleopatra, in being a stylish queen as she was, insisted that her ships have their sails dyed purple, which is a big deal because purple was a super expensive thing in those days. I don't know if that story is true, but then the claim was the fire that started in the ships spread to the Library of Alexandria and destroyed it. That's one story. Another story is the Islamic invaders came in at some point and were claimed to have said, of all this learning and all these scrolls, if it's not in the Quran, we don't want to know about it. And if it is in the Quran, we don't need it. And it was said that, they were burning the scrolls for winter fuel and so on. Probably all these stories are false. There were fires at the Library of Alexandria, at least one of its locations. How the Library of Alexandria decayed over the course of 500 years or more, it's not clear, but it's probably most of these sort of the glib story told against. I think there's a version of it told against the Muslim invaders, another one told against the Christian invaders, and they're all kind of fake news, so to speak, I suspect. I suspect that the actual truth of it was probably a lot more prosaic, that it's really hard to preserve something over the course of hundreds of years. I mean, the Library of Alexandria had been sort of a combination library where there are a bunch of collections of 10,000 scrolls or maybe more, 50,000 scrolls, whatever, as well as a university where people were teaching things about sort of the knowledge in those scrolls. And I don't really know what the kind of workflow was, whether there was a librarian who was the keeper of the scrolls and they were sort of behind in the stacks, so to speak, probably quite literally with scrolls. And if you showed up, I am, whatever of whatever, I'm so and so of such and such a place, and you show up there and you say, I want this scroll, or tell me about scrolls about atomism. And the librarian who would have read the scrolls maybe would say, yes, I think you should look up Democritus. Here's, let me go and fetch a scroll from Democritus. And then you would open it out and maybe you would copy it, or maybe you would just read it there. Or maybe there would be people there who were like interpreters of the library who would say, well, let me tell you about this. I don't even know whether the visitors to the library were literate. I don't even know if they could read. Probably they could, but perhaps the people who were there were partly for interpreters who could read the stuff. I mean, I also don't know whether there were scribes there who would do things like, if you say, well, I want a copy of that, it's kind of like back in when I was a kid, one of the big tech things for me was that you could go to a university library. I did this a lot when I was like 14 years old, 15 years old, and there were there were coin-operated photocopiers. So I still have many of the photocopies I made. They're decaying a little bit from that time, where you could, you got a bunch of coins and you put them in the photocopier and you could copy a bunch of things. And that was a big deal. Now, of course, that's old news technology at this point. But I don't know in the time of the Library of Alexandria whether you would show up there and you would pay some scribe to copy out this thing, and then you would read it you'd go back to wherever and you'd read it at your house in wherever it was. All right. In any case, I don't know what the story of our current storage media. I mean, I have to say, in my observation of my own archives, the only thing that works is continuous online storage. That is, if I keep things online, I know the bits are going to be preserved. The bits are going to be translated from one SSD to the next and so on, and I won't lose things. If it's off on tape, I might not be able to read the tape. Sort of a related story from a person I know who does medical research, who she was looking at records from the Second World War and from the Gulf War. And the records from the Second World War are much better than the records from the Gulf War for US troops. And the reason is the Second World War records are on paper and they got preserved somewhere. The ones from the Gulf War were on computers. And when those computers came back from the sort of theater of war, they were all erased, perhaps for some security reason, but they were erased. So that data was gone. And the medical records from that time are simply gone. And it's down to people remembering, oh yeah, I got that vaccination, or I didn't, or whatever else, or I wasn't paying attention, or whatever. Whereas those records from the Second World War in paper form are much better preserved. And I think that's a lesson for the preservation of things. And as I say, in my own experience of keeping archives, the only thing that definitively works is preserve the bits. I mean, actually preserve them as online bits, where it isn't a question of worrying about whether the storage medium is going to go on working, because you know continuously that those bits are available. All right. Well, thanks for asking all kinds of interesting questions. And I need to go off to my day job here. But thanks for joining me, and see you another time. Bye for now.